Every square of that quilt held a piece of someone I buried. My wife's wedding blouse, my mother's Sunday scarf, my baby boy's first pajamas. I stitched them together over 4 quiet months in my cabin, and when I placed it on the gift table at my grandson's celebration, my daughter-in-law wrinkled her nose and said, "Is this used fabric?" My son looked at his shoes. Nobody in that room knew that the old man holding a pile of memories was also holding the deed to the building they were standing in. As we dive into today's story, I am curious, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Please note, this story is fictional, created for entertainment and learning. Any similarities to real people or events are purely coincidental, but the message is meaningful. Now, let us see what unfolds. The late afternoon sun of an October Saturday did not simply illuminate the grand reception hall of Hawthorne Lodge. It interrogated everything it touched. It caught the razor edges of the crystal chandeliers, the arrangement of white orchids cascading from silver vases, and the polished expressions on the faces of 70 guests. This was a room built for people who measured their worth by the labels on their clothing. I stood inside the entrance archway, holding a bundle wrapped in heavy, unbleached muslin. It weighed maybe 4 pounds, but the heaviness I felt had everything to do with the 4 months I had spent hunched over my late wife's quilting frame, pushing a needle through fabric that carried the fingerprints of the dead. The room smelled of catered crab cakes and designer perfume. My grandson Tommy was cradled in the arms of my daughter-in-law. Jacqueline Devereaux Jennings stood beneath the largest chandelier, like a porcelain figure inside a display case. Her mother, Constance Devereaux, sat beside her with the quiet authority of a seated empress. Constance owned a fashion brokerage in Charleston built on 3 generations of old Southern money and a talent for looking down at the rest of the world. Brendan appeared from the crowd. He did not walk toward me with open arms. He stopped 6 feet away, holding a glass of sparkling water like a barrier. His eyes dropped to the muslin bundle, and a flicker crossed his face. It was not warmth. It was the involuntary wince of a man who has spotted an uninvited variable in a controlled environment. "Dad, you made it," he said with practiced brightness. "You could have left the gift with the coordinator. They are sorting everything by category." "I wanted to carry it myself," I replied. He gestured toward the gift table draped in dove-gray linen, surrounded by professionally wrapped packages bearing logos of stores I had never entered. I walked through the crowd. Nobody acknowledged me. Yet I felt 70 people silently cataloging the fact that my sport coat was 15 years old and my hands were permanently stained with dye no amount of scrubbing could remove. When the opening of gifts began, the room settled into a rehearsed hush. Jacqueline unwrapped Italian baby shoes, a sterling silver rattle, and an electronic monitoring system that looked like hospital equipment. Every reveal drew a synchronized chorus of admiration. Then it was my turn. I stepped forward and unfolded the muslin. The quilt lay on the dove-gray linen, its colors deep and quiet against the surrounding perfection. The pale blue square near the center was cut from the pajamas Brendan wore the night he came home from the hospital 35 years ago. The ivory along the border came from Margaret's wedding blouse, sewn by her own hands the week before our ceremony. The dark green at the bottom corner was cut from my mother's Sunday church scarf. "I made it for Tommy," I said. "Every piece comes from someone in our family." Jacqueline pinched the corner between her thumb and index finger, lifting it roughly 3 inches off the table. She held it for 4 seconds, examining it the way a health inspector examines suspect produce. "Is this used fabric?" she asked. The polite, measured tone made the words cut twice as deep. Constance leaned forward and touched the edge with 2 fingertips, as though testing whether the material might stain her skin. She retracted her hand without a word. But the expression on her face delivered a verdict louder than any sentence. The object was beneath her. The man who made it was a blemish on an otherwise flawless afternoon. The silence stretched across the hall like a thread pulled dangerously taut. I looked at Brendan. My son, the boy who once sat beneath his mother's quilting frame, tangling himself in loose thread, laughing until his body shook. He stood beside his wife, jaw tight, gaze fixed on the marble floor between his Italian leather shoes. She registered at Pottery Barn for a reason. "Dad," Brendan said, quietly, without looking at me. "Maybe next time, just send a gift card." A few guests shifted. Most looked away. I did not respond. I did not explain that the walnut brown square near the top left contained fibers from a shirt I was wearing the night I held a dying man in my arms in a jungle on the other side of the world. I did not tell them that every stitch was a sentence in a love letter to a grandson who would one day need to know where he came from. I folded the quilt along the creases I had pressed that morning, wrapped it inside the muslin, and tucked it under my arm. I sat in my chair for 8 more minutes. I watched them open a cashmere baby blanket. Retail price $420. Nobody spoke to me. Nobody offered me a drink. To 70 people in that room, I had become part of the scenery, and not the kind worth admiring. I walked to the exit. The valet took his time retrieving my vehicle, sensing the man in the worn sport coat was not the type to tip generously. I climbed into my van. The engine turned over with a rough, familiar cough. The quilt sat on the passenger seat, its muslin slightly undone, a corner of Margaret's wedding blouse peeking through the fold like a pale hand reaching out. I did not cry. The tears had been trained out of me decades ago, in a place far more hostile than a country club dining room. I stared through the windshield, at the imposing facade of Hawthorne Lodge. My mind drifted away from the chandeliers. It drifted toward the cabin, at the end of a gravel road on the ridge, toward a specific hallway, and a steel cabinet bolted to the floor behind a rack of winter coats. Nobody in that room knew what was inside that cabinet. Brendan certainly did not. He believed he knew exactly who his father was, a retired factory worker with stained hands and nothing left to offer except scraps of used fabric. I whispered 2 words to the empty cab. Used fabric. Then I started the engine. And for the first time in years, I started planning. The gravel crunched beneath my tires as the van climbed the narrow switchback road leading up the ridge. The headlights carved 2 pale tunnels through the October darkness, illuminating brief flashes of crimson and gold leaves clinging to the branches overhead. When I killed the engine outside the cabin, the silence of the mountain rushed in to fill the vacuum, absolute and ancient. I carried the muslin bundle inside. The moment I crossed the threshold, the familiar scent of cedar, machine oil, and old pine wrapped around me like the arms of a ghost. It was a sharp, honest smell, the polar opposite of the manufactured perfume still clinging to the fibers of my sport coat. I placed the quilt back on the 3rd shelf above my workbench in the sewing room, settling it into the faint rectangular outline of clean dust it had occupied for 4 months before today. Inside the main room, the quiet was different from the silence at Hawthorne Lodge. That silence had been heavy with judgment. This silence was heavy with memory. Every wall, every floorboard, every hairline crack in the plaster carried the residue of a life built by 2 pairs of hands over decades of stubborn, unrelenting love. I filled the kettle and set it on the stove. Steeping black tea after dark was a ritual older than my grief, a habit Margaret and I had shared every single evening for 36 years. While the water heated, my eyes drifted to the framed photograph resting on the kitchen windowsill. Margaret. She had been gone 12 years. Yet there were still mornings when I reached across the bed, expecting to feel the warmth of her shoulder beneath my palm. She was 62 when her heart simply stopped. No warning, no dramatic decline. She was sitting at her quilting frame on a Tuesday afternoon in April, humming a song I could never quite identify. And then she was not. The needle dropped from her fingers. The thread hung suspended in the air like an unfinished sentence. The paramedics arrived in 11 minutes. But the woman who had taught me that fabric could hold more truth than any spoken word was already gone. After the funeral, I stood alone in the living room, staring at the quilting frame. The project she had been working on was still stretched across the wooden rails, a half-completed pattern of interlocking rings in shades of deep burgundy and forest green. 3/4 of the stitching was flawless. The final quarter was an empty grid of unmarked fabric, waiting for hands that would never return. I did not dismantle the frame. I sat down in her chair, threaded the needle exactly the way she had taught me 40 years earlier, and finished the quilt myself. It took me 9 days. I did not eat properly during that period. I barely slept. I simply pushed the needle through the cloth over and over, each stitch a word in a conversation I was not ready to end. When the final knot was tied, I folded the completed quilt, pressed my face into the fabric, and breathed in the faint trace of lavender hand cream that somehow still lingered in the fibers. Then I placed it in the cedar chest at the foot of our bed and closed the lid. The kettle screamed. I poured the water, dropped a tea bag into the mug, and walked away from the kitchen. My feet carried me down the narrow hallway, without any conscious instruction. The floorboards groaned beneath my weight, in a sequence I knew by heart. At the very end of the corridor, hidden behind a thick rack of winter coats and flannel shirts, stood a door I had not opened in a very long time. The storage room smelled of dry paper and trapped air. I navigated past stacked cardboard boxes, a broken dehumidifier, and 2 filing cabinets full of old tax returns. In the far corner, bolted directly into the concrete foundation, sat a heavy olive-drab fireproof filing cabinet. It was military surplus, built to survive conditions that would reduce ordinary furniture to ash. I pulled a small brass key from the inner pocket of my wallet. A key I carried every single day but had not used in over 3 years. The lock resisted for a fraction of a second before the internal tumblers surrendered with a loud metallic clack. I gripped the handle and pulled. The steel drawer rolled open with a long, protesting groan, releasing the scent of old parchment into the stale air. Inside, arranged with a precision that bordered on obsessive, sat 37 thick manila folders. Each one contained a stamped and notarized warranty deed for a commercial or residential property stretching across 4 counties in western North Carolina. They were organized alphabetically by township and zoning district. Behind the deed folders, a separate reinforced sleeve held the certified United States patent registration for a proprietary fire-resistant textile compound, patent number 7419832. Assigned to the inventor Walter R. Jennings. The royalty agreement attached to the patent bore the seal of the Department of Defense. The bottom section of the drawer housed the corporate architecture, articles of organization for an entity registered under the name WRJ Holdings LLC, Walter R. Jennings, sole member. The operating agreements, the tax identification filings, the quarterly distribution statements from a diversified portfolio of municipal bonds and blue-chip equities. All of it was there, stacked with the quiet discipline of a man who understood that empires are not built with noise. If a forensic accountant were to calculate the total current market value of every asset resting inside this steel drawer, the figure would settle right around $31 million. An invisible kingdom assembled over 26 years of silence, discipline, and hands that never stopped working. I did not pull the folders out to examine them. I knew every number by heart. I touched them, to feel the texture of the decades compressed into the paper. The duplex in Millbrook was purchased with overtime wages earned during the ice storm of 2004. The downtown commercial lot was acquired by flipping a condemned property while sleeping 3 hours a night. Every deed was paid for with isolation and sweat. I pushed the drawer shut. The latch engaged with a deep, final click. I slid my back down the wall and sat on the cold floorboards, pulling my knees up to my chest. The pressure building behind my sternum was not physical exhaustion. It was the terrifying weight of what I was about to do. Across the room, a small framed photograph of Margaret hung near the doorframe. I looked up at her face, barely visible in the darkness. "It is time, Maggie," I whispered. "Our boy is building his whole life on the arm of a woman who would spit on your quilting frame. It is time." But the memory that surfaced next was not Margaret. It was older. It was the smell of burning canvas in the Mekong Delta, and the voice of a dying 23-year-old kid who called me Stitch. Vietnam did not smell the way the movies tell you it smelled. It did not smell like gunpowder or heroism. It smelled like rot. Sweet, heavy, inescapable rot. The jungle floor was a living carpet of decomposing leaves and standing water, and the humidity pressed against your skin like a second set of clothing you could never peel off. In the summer of 1972, I was 22 years old, carrying a standard-issue rucksack, a sewing kit I had packed from home, and a fear so deep it had burrowed into the marrow of my bones and made a permanent nest there. Our platoon was stationed along a muddy tributary south of the Mekong Delta. There were 19 of us. We slept in shallow foxholes, lined with plastic sheeting that never managed to keep the water out. We ate cold rations in the dark because heating anything produced light. And light in that jungle was an invitation to die. Ray Dominguez was assigned the foxhole directly adjacent to mine. He was 23 years old, born and raised in El Paso, Texas, the youngest of 6 children in a family that spoke Spanish at the dinner table and English everywhere else. He had thick black hair that violated every military grooming regulation in existence, a gap between his front teeth wide enough to whistle through, and an absolute inability to take anything seriously for longer than 45 seconds. On our second night in position, I was sitting on the edge of my foxhole mending a torn seam on my field jacket. The needle moved through the olive-drab fabric with a rhythm that calmed the constant tremor in my hands. Ray watched me from his hole, his chin resting on his crossed arms. "You carry a sewing kit into a combat zone?" he asked, his voice carrying the faint melodic lilt of the border. "My mother taught me," I said without looking up. "She said a man who can mend his own clothes will never be completely helpless." Ray stared at me for a long moment. Then the gap-toothed grin spread across his face. "I am calling you Stitch," he declared, as though naming a stray dog he had decided to keep. "From now until we get out of this swamp, you are Stitch." The name stuck. Within a week, every man in the platoon was bringing me their torn shirts, split seams, and busted bootlaces. I sat in the mud every evening with my needle and thread, repairing the fabric that held 19 men together in a place designed to tear everything apart. Ray sat beside me every single night, talking. He talked about his mother's enchiladas. He talked about the girl he was going to marry when he got home, a dental hygienist named Rosa, who wrote him letters on pink stationery. He talked about opening a mechanic shop in El Paso with his older brother. He talked because talking kept the darkness away. And I listened because listening kept my hands steady. The night of August 14th, the jungle exploded. There was no warning. One moment the air held nothing but the dense electric hum of insects. The next moment, the tree line erupted in a wall of light and sound that shredded the distinction between earth and sky. Automatic weapons fire ripped through the canopy overhead, sending a rain of splintered wood and shredded leaves cascading into our positions. I pressed my face into the mud and crawled. The world reduced itself to a tunnel of noise and muzzle flash. Somewhere to my left, a man was screaming. Somewhere ahead, another voice was shouting coordinates into a radio that may or may not have been functioning. Then I heard Ray. His voice cut through the chaos with a clarity that defied the surrounding destruction. "Stitch." The single word carried more terror than I had ever heard, compressed into 2 syllables. I crawled toward the sound, dragging my body across roots and standing water. I found him in a shallow depression, 15 meters from our original position. He was on his back. His legs were twisted at angles that the human skeleton does not accommodate voluntarily. A piece of white-hot shrapnel had torn through his left side just above the hip, and the fabric of his uniform was charred and melted into the wound. The air around him smelled of burning canvas and scorched flesh. "Stitch," he said again, quieter now. His right hand was gripping a fistful of mud. His eyes were wide open, reflecting the orange glow of a fire burning somewhere behind the tree line. I cannot feel my legs. I did not have a medical kit. I did not have morphine or bandages or any of the equipment that might have made a difference. I had my hands, and I had the shirt on my back. I ripped the fabric from my own body, tearing it into 3 wide strips. The sound of cotton shredding was swallowed by the gunfire. I pressed the first strip hard against the wound, feeling the wet heat of his blood soak through the cloth and coat my fingers instantly. "Hold on, Ray," I said. My voice was someone else's voice. It was a voice operating on a frequency below panic, below fear, in a basement of pure mechanical function. "Hold on." He gripped my forearm with a strength that seemed impossible for a man losing blood at that rate. His fingers dug into my skin hard enough to leave bruises that would last for weeks. He pulled me closer until my ear was inches from his mouth. "Stitch." His voice was barely a whisper now, riding on shallow, fractured breaths. Your hands save lives. Promise me." He coughed, and a fine mist of red hit my cheek. "Promise me you will never stop sewing." I pressed the second strip against his side. The cloth was already saturated. I could feel his heartbeat through the fabric, rapid and shallow. A machine running out of fuel. "I promise," I said. His grip loosened. His eyes shifted from my face toward the canopy above us, where the leaves were backlit by fire. The gap-toothed grin appeared one final time, faint and fading, like a light being slowly dialed down to zero. "Tell Rosa I almost made it home," he said. His hand released my arm. His chest rose once more, held for a long suspended moment, and then settled into a stillness that no amount of pressure or stitching could reverse. I knelt in the mud beside him, both palms still pressed against the soaked fabric, and I did not move until the gunfire finally stopped and the medics found us at dawn. They gave me a Purple Heart for a shrapnel wound in my left shoulder I had not even noticed. They gave Ray a folded flag. I carried that promise home in 1973. I carried it to the factory floor. I carried it into Margaret's quilting frame. I carried it through 26 years of silent empire building, through every stitch and every deed and every dollar hidden inside a fireproof cabinet. And 52 years later, I was still carrying it when a woman in a designer dress held my life's work with 2 fingers and called it used fabric. I came home from Vietnam in the spring of 1973 with a Purple Heart, a partially deaf left ear, and a promise lodged so deep inside my chest it had fused with the bone. The government gave me a discharge certificate, a handshake, and a bus ticket back to Appalachian, North Carolina. Nobody met me at the station. My father had died of a stroke 2 years prior while I was overseas. My mother was living with her sister in Knoxville, her mind already beginning its long, slow retreat into silence. I stepped off that bus into a cool March afternoon, carrying everything I owned in a single canvas duffel bag. The first job I found was at Ridgecrest Textiles, a sprawling industrial mill wedged between the railroad tracks and the Catawba River on the outskirts of Boone. The factory produced heavy-duty canvas, denim, and flame-resistant workwear for mining operations across the Southeast. I operated a commercial cutting machine on the second floor, feeding massive bolts of raw fabric through steel rollers 8 hours a day, 5 days a week. The noise was punishing. The mechanical thunder of the looms vibrated through the concrete floor and up through the soles of my boots into my jaw. But the rhythm was familiar. It was the rhythm of material being shaped by force and patience. And after the jungle, the predictability of a factory felt like mercy. On a Saturday afternoon in October of 1973, 7 months after my discharge, I drove my truck to the annual Watauga County Fair. I had no particular reason to go. I was not looking for entertainment or company. I was simply trying to fill the hours between shifts with something other than the sound of my own breathing inside an empty rented room. The quilting tent was set up near the livestock pavilion. I almost walked past it. But something in the periphery of my vision snagged my attention and held it with an authority I could not explain. A woman was sitting behind a wooden frame, her back straight, her fingers moving with a speed and precision that reminded me of the way a surgeon handles instruments. She was stitching a pattern of interlocking stars in shades of indigo and copper, and the fabric beneath her hands was transforming into something that stopped me mid-stride. Margaret Ann Calloway was 24 years old. She had auburn hair pulled back with a simple cloth band, freckles scattered across the bridge of her nose, and eyes the color of strong black tea held up to the light. She worked mornings at the Boone Public Library, shelving books and reading stories to children during the Tuesday afternoon program. She had learned to quilt from her grandmother, a woman who had survived the Depression by selling handmade blankets door to door across 3 counties. I stood at the entrance of that tent for probably 90 seconds before she noticed me. When she looked up, her hands did not stop moving. The needle kept its rhythm. "Are you going to stand there all afternoon, or are you going to come look at the stitching?" she asked. There was no flirtation in her voice. It was a direct, practical question from a woman who did not waste words. I walked over. I looked at the stitching. It was the most beautiful thing I had seen since before the war. "Every stitch is a sentence, you know," Margaret said, guiding the needle through a junction where 4 pieces of fabric converged. "Every quilt tells a story. The question is whether the person making it has anything worth saying." I asked her to teach me. She raised one eyebrow, studied my hands for a moment, noted the calluses and the faint tremor that still visited my fingers in the evenings, and handed me a needle without a single additional question. We sat in that tent until the fair closed at 9 o'clock. She showed me the basic running stitch, the blind hem, and the invisible ladder stitch used to close a binding. My fingers were clumsy, the thread tangled. She corrected my grip exactly 11 times without a trace of impatience. I drove her home that evening. We were married 14 months later in a small ceremony at the Boone United Methodist Church. 13 people attended. The reception was held in the church basement with a sheet cake and a punch bowl. Margaret wore a blouse she had sewn herself the week before. Ivory cotton with a delicate lace collar. I wore the only suit I owned. For the next 13 years, we built a life measured not in square footage or net worth, but in the steady accumulation of stitches. Margaret set up her quilting frame in the main room of the cabin I had purchased with my factory savings, a small 2-bedroom structure perched on a gravel road near the top of Elk Ridge. Every evening after dinner, she would settle into her chair, thread her needle, and begin. I would sit across from her with my own section, working the simpler borders and straight seams, while she handled the complex geometric centers that required a precision I never fully mastered. Brendan arrived in the spring of 1989. He was a healthy, loud, curious boy who discovered very early that the space beneath his mother's quilting frame was the most interesting place in the house. He would crawl under the stretched fabric like a soldier, navigating a low obstacle, surrounded by dangling threads and fallen scraps of colored cloth. He sorted buttons by color. He tangled himself in loose spools of thread and laughed at the chaos he created. Margaret never scolded him for disrupting her work. She simply reached down, untangled whatever knot he had produced, kissed the top of his head, and kept stitching. "One day, Walt," Margaret said on a warm evening in June, the cabin windows opened to the sound of crickets and the distant murmur of the creek, "we are going to make a quilt so beautiful. The whole mountain will want one." I looked at her across the quilting frame, the lamplight catching the copper threads in her hair. Our son, asleep beneath the stretched fabric, with a wooden spool clutched in his small fist, and I made a silent promise that I would give this woman everything the world had to offer, even if it took me the rest of my natural life. But in the garage behind the cabin, late at night when Margaret and the boy were sleeping, I was working on something else entirely. The fabric I was testing did not tear, it did not burn, and the United States military was about to come calling. The telephone mounted on the kitchen wall rang at 11 minutes past 2 on a Tuesday afternoon in October of 1993. I was standing at the sink scrubbing axle grease off my knuckles after replacing the brake pads on my truck. Margaret was at the library. Brendan, 4 years old, was sitting on the living room floor constructing a lopsided tower out of empty thread spools. The voice on the other end of the line identified himself as a procurement officer with the United States Department of Defense, Materials Division. He was calling in reference to a textile sample I had submitted 18 months earlier through a public innovation portal I had discovered in the back pages of an industrial supply catalog. He spoke in the clipped, efficient cadence of a man who evaluated 300 submissions a month and had learned to separate the serious from the delusional within the first 30 seconds of a conversation. He told me my fire-resistant compound had passed every single laboratory stress test their facility had administered. He told me the weave structure I had developed in my garage using a second-hand industrial loom and materials purchased from a surplus warehouse in Hickory had outperformed 3 proprietary formulas currently under contract with established defense manufacturers. He told me the department wanted to negotiate an exclusive licensing agreement. I leaned against the kitchen counter and stared at the 4-year-old boy on the living room floor, carefully balancing a red spool on top of a blue one with the focused intensity of an engineer. "How much?" I asked. The initial licensing fee was $2.1 million, payable in structured installments over 24 months. In addition, the agreement included an annual royalty tied to production volume, meaning every yard of fire-resistant fabric manufactured under my patent would generate a small but compounding return. The officer asked if I had legal representation. I told him I would call him back. Then I hung up the phone, sat down on the kitchen floor next to my son, and helped him balance the red spool. My hands were steady. My mind was not. That evening, after Margaret had gone to bed and the cabin was dark, I walked out to the garage, closed the door behind me, and sat on the concrete floor beneath the bare overhead bulb. The industrial loom sat in the corner like a quiet co-conspirator. Scraps of test fabric hung from wire hooks along the wall, each one marked with handwritten notes documenting burn temperatures, tensile strength, and fiber composition. I did not tell Margaret the full scope of the contract. I told her a company had purchased a fabric design I had been developing, and that it would bring in some additional income. She was pleased but not particularly impressed. Margaret measured wealth in completed quilts, shelved library books, and the sound of her son laughing under the quilting frame. The mathematics of a defense contract existed in a language she neither spoke nor cared to learn. The first royalty check arrived in the spring of 1994. I deposited it into a separate account at a small community bank in Marion, 30 miles south of Boone, where nobody knew my face or my occupation. Then I began to plan. The strategy was not complex. It was brutally simple, grounded in the same principle that governed every piece of fabric I had ever handled. You cannot build something strong with weak material. You start with the foundation, and you reinforce it until it can bear weight that would crush anything built in haste. I bought my first property in the spring of 1995. It was a condemned 2-bedroom house on a dead-end road in the Millbrook district, a forgotten stretch of crumbling asphalt south of Asheville where investors saw only liability. The bank was desperate to unload it for $47,000. I paid cash from the royalty account. The house was a catastrophe. The roof leaked in 9 places. The plumbing was corroded beyond repair. Mold had colonized the bathroom walls with the confidence of a permanent resident. But I did not need to hire a crew. I had spent 20 years operating heavy machinery and handling industrial materials. I knew how to read a load-bearing wall and how to sweat a copper joint. What I did not know, I learned from library books Margaret brought home for me, without asking why I suddenly needed volumes on residential electrical codes and septic system maintenance. Brendan was 6 years old when the Millbrook house renovation began. On Saturday mornings, I would load him into the truck and drive south. He wore a pair of oversized denim overalls that Margaret had sewn from remnant fabric, and he carried a small plastic toolbox containing a tape measure, a pencil, and a bag of assorted nails. He could not swing a hammer with any meaningful force, but he could sort galvanized nails by size, hold a flashlight steady while I worked inside dark crawl spaces, and tape off baseboards for painting with a patience that surprised me. Those Saturdays were the architecture of our bond. Father and son side by side, covered in drywall dust and latex paint, eating gas station sandwiches on an overturned bucket in a half-finished living room. Brendan never questioned why we spent our weekends rebuilding a stranger's house. He simply assumed it was what fathers and sons did together. He never saw the paperwork. Every deed, every mortgage document, every corporate filing was processed under the name WRJ Holdings LLC, an entity I registered quietly through a business attorney in Asheville named Arthur Crowley. Art was a sharp, meticulous man who understood the value of silence. He never asked me why a textile factory worker needed a limited liability corporation. He simply built the legal architecture and sent me the invoices. 7 months later, the Millbrook house was finished. I found a young couple with a newborn to rent it. Their monthly payment covered the mortgage and left exactly $89 in profit. It was a tiny spark, but I had learned from Margaret that a single thread, pulled through fabric with enough patience, could hold an entire quilt together. I bought a second property 3 years later. Then a third. The strategy was agonizingly slow but mathematically inevitable. While other men upgraded their trucks or booked vacation cruises, I wore the same flannel jackets until the elbows gave out. If my boots cracked, I sealed them with industrial adhesive. Every spare dollar flowed back into real estate. By the time Brendan graduated college in 2012, I owned 15 properties. By 2020, that number had grown to 37, including a luxury resort called Hawthorne Lodge on the Western Ridge outside Asheville, acquired for $3.8 million during the economic chaos of the global pandemic. Through it all, I never quit my day job. I clocked in at Ridgecrest Textiles every morning until my retirement in 2018. Brendan used to ask me why I would not stop working. He did not understand. Wealth cannot teach a man dignity. Only labor does. Some foundations are strongest when they are invisible. Margaret did not give me the courtesy of a warning. There was no gradual decline, no series of doctor visits with increasingly grave expressions, no slow dimming of the light that would have allowed me to brace for the darkness. She was there, and then she was not. The human heart, I learned, does not always announce its intention to stop. It was a Tuesday afternoon in the second week of April, 2012. The dogwoods along the ridge had just begun to bloom, scattering white petals across the gravel road like confetti at a celebration nobody had planned. I was at the Ridgecrest factory finishing my shift, tightening the tension bolts on a cutting machine that had been pulling fabric off center all morning. My cell phone buzzed in the pocket of my work trousers at precisely 3:17. The caller was our neighbor, Doris Honeycutt, a retired postal worker who lived in the cabin a quarter-mile down the ridge. Her voice was shaking so violently that the words came out in broken fragments. I could not assemble them into a coherent sentence. But I did not need to. The pitch of a human voice, when it carries the news of death, occupies a frequency that bypasses the brain entirely and strikes the center of the chest like a physical blow. I drove home in 11 minutes. The distance normally required 20. I do not remember the road. I do not remember the turns. I remember the dogwood petals hitting my windshield like snow. The paramedics were already inside the cabin when I pushed through the front door. 2 of them were kneeling beside Margaret's quilting frame. She was still in her chair, slumped slightly to the left, her right hand resting on the stretched fabric, as though she had simply decided to take a brief nap in the middle of a stitch. The needle was still threaded. It hung from the last point of entry in the cloth, suspended by a single length of burgundy thread, swaying almost imperceptibly in the draft from the open door. She was 62 years old. The official cause was sudden cardiac arrest. The doctor at the hospital used the phrase catastrophic electrical failure, as though my wife's heart had been a machine that simply short-circuited. He told me she would not have felt pain. He told me it happened in less than 10 seconds. He told me these things as though the speed of the destruction was supposed to provide comfort. I buried Margaret on a Friday morning beneath a dogwood tree in the Elk Ridge Community Cemetery. 23 people attended. The minister read from Ecclesiastes. Brendan flew in from Charlotte, where he had recently started a junior position at a corporate consulting firm. He stood beside me at the graveside in a dark suit that fit him too well. And when it was over, he squeezed my shoulder once, told me to call if I needed anything, and caught a flight back that same evening. I did not blame him for leaving quickly. Young men do not yet understand that grief is not an event. It is a season. That night, I sat alone in the main room of the cabin. The quilting frame stood exactly where Margaret had left it. The half-completed project was still stretched across the wooden rails, a pattern of interlocking rings in deep burgundy and forest green. 3/4 of the design was finished, each stitch placed with the surgical precision that defined everything Margaret touched. The final quarter was an empty grid of unmarked fabric, a blank page waiting for a hand that had already written its last word. I stared at that frame for a very long time. The silence in the cabin was not the restful quiet of a mountain evening. It was the roaring, deafening silence of absence, the sound a room makes when it is still shaped around a person who has been physically removed from it. At some point after midnight, I stood up. I walked to Margaret's sewing basket, retrieved her needle case, selected a number 8 sharp, and threaded it with the burgundy thread she had been using. I sat down in her chair. The cushion still held the impression of her body. I could smell the faint trace of the lavender hand cream she applied every evening before she began to stitch. I placed my rough fingers on the fabric and pushed the needle through. The first stitch was clumsy. The tension was wrong. Margaret would have frowned and made me pull it out and start again. But Margaret was not there to correct me, so I continued. I pushed the needle through the cloth, pulled the thread taut, repositioned, and pushed again. The repetition gradually settled into a rhythm that quieted the screaming inside my skull. I did not stop for 9 days. I ate when my hands trembled too badly to hold the needle. I slept in fragments, collapsing into the armchair beside the frame for 2 or 3 hours before the dawn light woke me, and I resumed. The stitches I produced were not as clean as hers. The spacing was slightly uneven in places, but I was not trying to match her skill. I was trying to finish the conversation she had started. On the 9th evening, I tied the final knot. I cut the thread with her small silver scissors, removed the completed quilt from the frame, and held it up to the lamplight. The burgundy and green rings interlocked seamlessly, her work blending into mine at a junction so subtle that only someone who knew exactly where to look could identify the point where Margaret's hands ended and mine began. I pressed my face into the fabric. The lavender was still there, buried deep in the fibers, faint but unmistakable. I breathed it in until my lungs ached. Then I folded the quilt with deliberate care, placed it inside the cedar chest at the foot of our bed, and closed the heavy lid. I did not open that chest again. After Margaret, I stopped talking to people about things that mattered. I poured every ounce of grief into concrete and timber and property acquisitions. Nobody would ever trace back to a retired textile worker on Elk Ridge. The empire grew in the silence she left behind, expanding steadily through the years like a vine climbing a wall in the dark. And I waited, without fully understanding what I was waiting for, until the summer of 2019, when my son brought a stranger through my kitchen door, and the long, slow unraveling of everything I had built began to accelerate toward a destination I could not yet see. The screen door of my kitchen squeaked open on a sweltering July afternoon in 2019. I turned from the sink, drying my hands on a dish towel, expecting to see the boy who used to sort nails in oversized denim. Instead, a 30-year-old man in a tailored navy blazer stepped over the threshold. And on his arm was a woman whose shoes alone could have covered my electric bill for 6 months. Jacqueline Devereaux offered a practiced, pleasant greeting. Her voice was smooth, calibrated to project warmth without actually containing any. But as I poured her a glass of iced tea from the pitcher Margaret and I had used for decades, I watched her eyes. They moved across the faded wallpaper, the scuffed linoleum, the chipped ceramic sink, and the quilting frame still standing in the main room, still holding the ghost of a woman whose chair had not been moved since 2012. It was not a glare of contempt. It was the clinical, sweeping assessment of an appraiser. She was calculating the total net worth of my existence. And the final number, clearly registered, as negligible. I did not feel anger in that moment. I felt something more primal and far more dangerous. I felt the atmospheric pressure in the room shift, the way the air changes density seconds before a storm front crosses a mountain ridge. My son was introducing me to the woman he intended to marry. And the woman was already measuring the distance she would need to create between herself and the cabin on Elk Ridge. What broke my heart was not Jacqueline's quiet judgment. It was how Brendan reacted to it. When she was in the room, my son altered his own gravity. He stood straighter. His vocabulary became unnaturally polished. His genuine laugh, the one I remembered from Saturday mornings in half-finished living rooms, was replaced by a tight, rehearsed chuckle. He was constantly monitoring her expression from the corner of his eye, seeking approval for the environment he had come from. That afternoon was the beginning of a disappearing act. Losing a child to another life does not usually happen with a slamming door. It happens through 100 tiny, silent withdrawals, each one so small that by the time you notice the pattern, the person standing in front of you is already a stranger. The casual weekend visits vanished entirely by the spring of 2020. Brendan had been promoted to a mid-level position at his firm and was spending increasing amounts of time attending events with Jacqueline's social circle. The phone calls shifted from sprawling, honest conversations about his career to scheduled 10-minute check-ins during his commute, calls that felt less like connection and more like a recurring calendar entry he had not yet figured out how to delete. By the summer of 2021, I was at their wedding in Charleston, South Carolina. The Devereaux family had orchestrated the entire affair at a sprawling estate draped in white linen and imported flowers. Constance floated through the reception, ensuring every detail reflected the immaculate standards of a family whose wealth was measured in generations rather than bank statements. The father of the bride delivered a 20-minute toast. The best man, a private equity analyst, gave a speech that sounded like an earnings report. I sat at table 11, the farthest from the head table, sipping water from a crystal glass. A week prior, Brendan had called to explain that the wedding planner maintained a very strict format and there simply was not a window for me to speak. I told him not to worry about it. I meant it. The words a father wants to say to his son on his wedding day are not meant for an audience. They are meant for a quiet room and 2 chairs. But the quiet room was never offered. The distance widened into a canyon the following year, Thanksgiving of 2022. I had bought a small turkey, expecting Brendan to drive up for at least a few hours. He called on Tuesday evening. "Dad." His voice carried that familiar weighted hesitation I had come to recognize as the preamble to a cancellation. "Constance and Richard are hosting a big dinner at their place in Kiowa Island. They want me there the whole weekend." He paused. "I would ask you to come, but you know how they are. The crowd is mostly investors and politicians. Honestly, Dad, you would not be comfortable." He was not protecting me from them. He was protecting them from me. "Okay, son," I said. "Drive safe." I hung up the phone and ate Thanksgiving dinner alone at my kitchen table, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the faint creak of the quilting frame in the next room. The final fracture happened on Brendan's 35th birthday. I had always called at exactly 8 in the morning, a tradition stretching back to his college years. This time, it went straight to voicemail. I left a brief, warm message and went about my day. The hours crawled. Noon. 3. 5. At 7:15, my phone vibrated. "Dad, hey." Brendan was speaking rapidly, the aggressive clatter of a keyboard audible in the background. "Got your voicemail. Thanks. Listen, I am absolutely buried right now. We have a massive deal closing and Jacqueline is blowing up my other line about some charity gala tickets. Can we do this another time?" He sounded like a man swatting a persistent insect. "Of course," I said quietly. "Happy birthday, Brendan." I ended the call and stood on my back porch, looking out at the detached garage. Through the dusty window pane, I could see the outline of a small wooden stool sitting in the corner. The exact spot where a 6-year-old boy in oversized denim overalls used to sit for hours sorting thread spools by color while his father worked on projects that would one day be worth millions. I took a long breath and let the mountain air fill my lungs. I did not know it at that exact moment. But while I stood there mourning the ghost of my son, across town in a high-end restaurant, Jacqueline was sitting down for a private, hushed meeting. and the person sitting across from her was someone who had been keeping my secrets for 18 years. The following morning, long before the sun cleared the eastern ridge, I sat at my kitchen table with a mug of black tea and a decision that had been crystallizing in my chest since the moment I closed that steel drawer. It was time to begin transferring the assets of WRJ Holdings into a protected structure that would ensure the empire survived me and served the purpose I had always intended for it. That process required one man. I picked up my phone at exactly 7:15 and dialed Arthur Crowley. Art had been the legal architect of my invisible kingdom since 2006. He was a sharp-featured, meticulously organized attorney who operated out of a modest office on the third floor of a brownstone in downtown Asheville. He did not advertise. He did not accept walk-in consultations. His clientele consisted entirely of referrals, and every single one of them valued one thing above all else: silence. The line connected on the second ring. Art was the kind of man who answered his phone on Sunday mornings because the distinction between workdays and weekends had been irrelevant to him for decades. "Art, it is Walt," I said, keeping my voice low and even. "I need to begin the estate transfer protocols we discussed last spring. I want to restructure the distribution framework for the entire portfolio." There was a pause. In 18 years of working with Arthur Crowley, I had learned that his pauses were never empty. They were calculated intervals during which he arranged information into its most dangerous configuration before releasing it. "Walt," Art said. His voice had dropped a full register. "I need you to come to my office today. Not tomorrow. Today." "I can come this afternoon," I replied, frowning slightly. "Is there an issue with the legal framework?" "The framework is fine," Art said. "But I received a phone call yesterday afternoon at approximately 3:30, roughly 1 hour after you would have left that event at Hawthorne Lodge. The call came directly to my private line because my receptionist does not work weekends." I set down my mug. The tea inside had gone cold without my noticing. "It was a woman," Art continued. She identified herself as Jacqueline Devereaux Jennings. She stated that she was calling regarding a delicate family matter and wanted to schedule an immediate consultation. The kitchen was completely silent. I could hear the faint tick of the clock on the wall above the stove, counting seconds that suddenly felt heavier than they had a moment ago. She asked me to outline the precise legal requirements for establishing an involuntary financial conservatorship over a family member, Art said, each word delivered with the clinical detachment of a surgeon describing an incision. She claimed her father-in-law was exhibiting severe signs of cognitive decline and erratic behavior. She wanted to know how quickly a judge could declare you legally incompetent, strip you of your financial autonomy, and grant her and her husband full power of attorney over your affairs. I did not blink. I did not breathe. The silence in the cabin stretched and thickened until it became a physical weight pressing against the walls. Jacqueline was not merely embarrassed by my existence. She was not simply maneuvering to keep me away from her social circles or training my son to treat me like a disposable inconvenience. She was executing a calculated legal operation designed to neutralize me entirely. She wanted to lock me inside a legal cage, seize control of the modest house and meager bank account she believed represented the full extent of my worth, and ensure that the old man with the used fabric could never again appear uninvited at one of her curated events. And in her absolute arrogance, she had searched for the most aggressive, highest-rated corporate attorney in the Asheville metropolitan area, selected the sharpest name in the directory, and dialed the direct private number of the one man on earth who held the keys to my $31 million empire. She also requested that I conduct a preliminary public asset search on you, Art added, a cold, precise amusement threading through his professional tone, just to determine what they would be working with when the court order went through. And what did the public records show? I asked, though I already knew the answer. A 1998 utility van, a modest savings account, a two-bedroom cabin on Elk Ridge, assessed at $147,000. Art paused again. WRJ Holdings is buried behind so many layers of corporate shielding that the Internal Revenue Service would need a geological survey team to locate it. She has absolutely no idea what she has stumbled into. What did you tell her? I asked. My voice reduced to gravel. I played the sympathetic professional. Art replied. I told her I would need to review the situation thoroughly, and that I would send her a retainer agreement and a preliminary strategy outline by Monday morning. Then I ended the call and waited for you to contact me. I stood up from the kitchen table. The sorrow and exhaustion I had carried home from Hawthorne Lodge the previous evening had evaporated completely, replaced by a cold, mechanical clarity that settled into my hands the way a blade settles into a groove. Send her the retainer agreement, I instructed. Bill her for every minute of your time. Tell her exactly what she wants to hear. Feed her whatever bureaucratic delays are necessary to keep her convinced the process is moving forward. Do not let her suspect anything. I need time. Art's pen scratched against paper on the other end of the line. And what are you going to do with that time? I need you to contact the forensic investigator we used during the commercial acquisition in 2018. I said, reaching for my jacket. The one who traced the discrepancies in the Buncombe County title records. Nina Alvarez, Art said, writing the name with a heavy stroke. She is the best in the state. What is the target? I want everything, I said. Bank records, tax filings, business accounts, personal expenditures, charitable donations, hidden debts. If she has an unpaid parking citation from 10 years ago, I want to read the ticket. I ended the call and walked out of the cabin into the sharp morning air. The Blue Ridge Mountains stretched across the horizon, ancient and indifferent, their peaks wrapped in the thin gray mist of early autumn. I was not thinking about my son anymore. I was turning the name Nina Alvarez over in my mind, and I was thinking about a single dangerous question. If Jacqueline was willing to execute a hostile legal takeover of an old man simply to preserve her social standing, it begged a much larger and far more unsettling inquiry. Who exactly was Jacqueline Devereaux Jennings? And what else was she hiding beneath that designer armor? Nina Alvarez did not operate out of a glass tower. Her workspace occupied the second floor of a converted warehouse on the eastern edge of Asheville's industrial district, wedged between a welding supply company and a commercial refrigeration repair shop. Walking into her office was like stepping inside a machine that had been calibrated to eliminate every unnecessary variable. There were no family photographs on the desk. There were no decorative plants on the windowsill. There was a laptop, a legal pad, a silver pen, and absolutely no tolerance for ambiguity. Nina was a former forensic accountant with the Internal Revenue Service, a woman who had spent 12 years hunting the financial ghosts that wealthy people tried to bury inside layered corporate structures. She had left government work to establish a private investigative practice, and her reputation among the legal community in Western North Carolina was built on a single, terrifying quality. She never guessed. She calculated. I sat across from her and laid out the basic arithmetic of my daughter-in-law's existence. Jacqueline Devereaux Jennings holds a mid-level management position at Devereaux & Associates, her mother's boutique fashion brokerage in Charleston, I explained, keeping my voice steady. Based on industry standards for that specific title and market, she earns approximately $90,000 a year. My son does well, but he is still a junior executive at a consulting firm. Nina did not nod. She poised the silver pen over the blank legal pad and waited. Yet they recently closed on a $1.3 million property in a gated community outside Asheville, I continued. There are 2 current model European SUVs in their driveway. They take biannual vacations to places like Milan and St. Bart's. She wears clothing that costs more than the first property I ever purchased. People leverage debt to maintain appearances all the time, Nina noted, her tone entirely devoid of emotion. Credit lines and aggressive mortgages can explain ambition. They cannot explain the arrogance required to initiate a hostile legal takeover of a family member, I replied. She is moving with the desperation of someone who needs absolute control over the people around her. I need to know why. Nina wrote 3 lines on the legal pad, capped her pen, and looked at me with pale, assessing eyes. 2 weeks, she said. The subsequent 14 days required a specific discipline. Waiting is a passive act for most people. But for a man who has spent his life shaping raw material into functional objects, patience is an active practice. You cannot force a seam to hold by pulling the thread harder. You simply make the next necessary stitch and trust the pattern. I maintained my routine. I woke before dawn, brewed my tea, and spent my mornings in the workshop behind the cabin. I was not building anything specific. I had a block of scrap cherrywood clamped to the bench, and I was slowly carving it into a shape that had no blueprint, letting my hands move through the grain while my mind navigated the dark water beneath the surface of my son's marriage. On the 11th evening, I was sitting at the kitchen table eating a sandwich when my phone rang. The caller identification displayed a local Asheville number. I picked up. Walt. Nina Alvarez's voice came through the speaker with a metallic precision that carried a dangerous edge I had not heard during our initial meeting. I have the file. The mathematics are significantly worse than you anticipated. I pushed the sandwich aside and pulled the laptop across the table. Send it. It is already in your encrypted inbox, she said. But I want to walk you through the architecture before you open it. Because this is not simple overspending or leveraged debt. Your daughter-in-law is operating a highly sophisticated tax fraud scheme using a charitable organization as the primary vehicle. I opened the laptop. The screen cast a harsh blue light across the dim kitchen. Devereaux and Associates files annual tax returns claiming substantial charitable contributions to an entity called the Veterans Vision Fund, Nina explained, her tone methodical, treating the crime the way a surgeon treats pathology. The fund is registered as a 501c3 nonprofit organization with a stated mission of providing medical assistance, surgical intervention, and transitional housing for visually impaired military veterans. How much? I asked. The two words sat heavy in my mouth. $1.7 million. Accumulated over approximately 3 years, Nina stated without hesitation. The donations are fraudulent. The Veterans Vision Fund exists on paper. It has a website, a mailing address, and a registered board of directors, composed entirely of shell identities. But it has never disbursed a single dollar to a single veteran. Every cent claimed as a charitable contribution was routed through the fund's clearing account and redirected into personal expenditure channels controlled by Jacqueline. I pressed the tip of my pen into the legal pad until the paper tore. Who are the victims? I asked, though a part of me already sensed the answer, forming in the pit of my stomach like a cold stone. That is the worst part of the audit, Nina said, her voice dropping a fraction. The tax deductions are calculated based on a roster of 53 individual veterans who are listed as active beneficiaries of the fund. These are real people, Walt. Real names, real service records, real disabilities. The average age is 68. Every single one of them is legally blind, most as a direct result of combat injuries sustained during active military service. The kitchen walls seem to contract around me. These veterans believe they are registered with a legitimate assistance program. Nina continued. Many of them have been told they are on a waiting list for corrective surgery or adaptive housing support. They have no idea that the organization claiming to help them is a hollow shell designed to generate fraudulent tax savings for a woman in Asheville. Constance, I said. Does the mother know? Willful blindness. Nina answered immediately. I pulled the internal access logs. Constance Devereaux opened the fund's clearing account records on 2 separate occasions last December. She is a veteran broker. She knows how to read a ledger. She saw the irregularities and she closed the window. She is not the architect, but she is absolutely complicit through her silence. I stared at the spreadsheet glowing on the screen. For 3 consecutive nights after that call, I sat at this same kitchen table and read every page of Nina's report. I did not skim the summary figures. I forced myself to read the individual case files. I translated the numbers into human reality. $800 diverted from a 71-year-old Marine meant that man was still navigating his apartment with a white cane, waiting for a surgery referral that would never arrive. $1,200 stolen from a 66-year-old Army sergeant meant that woman was rationing her medication because the transitional housing she had been promised remained a phantom on a spreadsheet. On the third night, near the bottom of the file, I stopped scrolling. My eyes locked onto a single entry on page 37. Frank Bukowski, age 74, branch of service, United States Army, disability, total bilateral blindness, resulting from improvised explosive device detonation, Fallujah, Iraq, 2005. Purple Heart recipient. Total amount diverted from his designated care allocation over 36 months. $22,400. The man who had lost his eyes serving the same flag I had served under was being systematically robbed by the woman sleeping in my son's bed. The Oakdale district occupied a stretch of Asheville that the tourist brochures never mentioned. It sat east of the river, wedged between the railroad switching yard and a decommissioned textile warehouse that had been sitting empty long enough for the kudzu to claim the loading docks. The streets were lined with narrow, aluminum-sided buildings constructed decades ago for the men who operated the factories and repaired the machines. It was a neighborhood where people measured their wealth not in portfolios but in the number of bills they had managed to pay on time. I parked my van on a cracked concrete pad and looked up at a weathered 3-story apartment building. The fire escape running down the side was rusted in places, and the front steps had been patched with mismatched lumber. The address matched the single devastating line I had memorized from Nina's spreadsheet. There was no elevator. I grabbed the wooden handrail, felt it shift loosely under my grip, and climbed the groaning stairs to the 3rd floor. The stairwell smelled of boiled potatoes and floor wax, and the particular brand of industrial disinfectant used by landlords who maintain appearances on the cheapest possible budget. I stopped in front of apartment 3C. I took a slow breath, pressed the tension out of my shoulders, and knocked 3 times. The deadbolt clicked. The door opened slowly, and standing in the frame was a man who looked exactly the way honor looks when it has been tested by decades of hardship and refused to break. Frank Bukowski was 74 years old. He was tall, slightly stooped at the shoulders, with close-cropped silver hair and a jaw that still carried the angular discipline of a career soldier. He wore a clean flannel shirt tucked into belted khaki trousers, and his feet were in worn leather slippers that had been resoled at least twice. His eyes were open but still, fixed at a point approximately 2 feet to the left of where I was actually standing. A white mobility cane leaned against the wall beside the door. "Can I help you?" he asked. His voice was deep and unhurried, the voice of a man who had learned to navigate the world through sound and texture rather than light. "Mr. Bukowski," I said, removing my cap. "My name is Walt Jennings. I apologize for arriving without notice. I am not from any government agency, and I am not selling anything. I am conducting an independent review of a specific Veterans Assistance Program you are enrolled in, and I was hoping to ask you a few questions." He tilted his head slightly, a gesture I recognized as the instinctive recalibration of a blind person redirecting their primary sensory attention toward the source of a voice. Something in my tone or cadence must have passed his inspection. Standing in a hallway is no way to have a conversation. "Mr. Jennings," Frank said, stepping aside. "Come on in. The coffee is still warm." The apartment was small, immaculate, and saturated with a lifetime of service. Every available surface held either a framed photograph or a military memento. A folded American flag in a triangular display case occupied the center of a bookshelf. Beside it, a Purple Heart medal rested in a velvet-lined box with the lid permanently open. On the opposite wall, a series of framed unit photographs showed progressively younger versions of the man standing before me, always in uniform, always standing straight. I sat in a firm upholstered chair. Frank moved to the kitchen with the practiced confidence of a person who has memorized the exact number of steps between every piece of furniture in his home. He returned carrying 2 ceramic mugs, placing mine on the coffee table with a precision that required no sight, only repetition. "The Veterans Vision Fund," Frank began, settling into his chair across from me. I have been enrolled for just over 2 years now. My daughter Linda found them online. She works the night shift at a distribution warehouse, and her husband drives a delivery route. They have 2 teenagers. They do not have the kind of money that covers specialized medical procedures. I listened with my hands resting quietly on my knees. Linda read about what happens when a veteran needs advanced eye surgery or long-term rehabilitative care without proper coverage, Frank continued, adjusting the cuff of his flannel shirt. The cost can dismantle a family in a matter of months. She was terrified that if my condition ever required surgical intervention, the bills would swallow everything she and her husband have managed to build. So she found the fund, I said gently. She found the fund, Frank confirmed with a small nod. They told us I was placed on a priority waiting list for a specialist consultation at a VA-affiliated surgical center. Corrective procedure for partial restoration of peripheral vision in the left eye. They said the funding cycle operates on a quarterly review basis, and that my case would be evaluated within 12 to 18 months. He paused, turning his mug slowly between his palms. That was 26 months ago, Frank said. Every time Linda calls the listed number, she gets a recorded message saying the office is experiencing high volume and someone will return her inquiry within 5 business days. Nobody ever calls back. The weight of what I was hearing pressed against my sternum like a steel plate. This man had lost his eyes in Fallujah. He had made his peace with the darkness. But he had not made his peace with being forgotten, and the organization that had promised him a sliver of light was nothing more than a hollow shell designed to fund my daughter-in-law's designer wardrobe. Mr. Bukowski, I said, looking directly at him even though he could not see my face. I am going to tell you something, and I need you to trust me. I cannot explain the full details this afternoon, but I give you my absolute word. By this time next week, the situation regarding your case is going to be very different. Frank did not press for clarification. He did not demand specifics. He simply reached across the space between our chairs and placed his hand on top of mine. His fingers moved slowly across my knuckles, feeling the thick calluses, the split skin along the nail beds, the permanent roughness built by decades of gripping needles, tools, and raw material. These are a working man's hands, Frank said quietly. A gentle recognition settled across his face. My father welded ship hulls for 30 years at the Norfolk Naval Yard. I know what labor does to a man's hands. He squeezed once. Firmly. I trust working hands, Mr. Jennings. I swallowed the knot building in my throat, nodded once, and stood. I picked up my cap, thanked him for the coffee, and walked out the door. I did not make it to the street. I stopped on the second-floor landing, leaned against the peeling plaster wall of the stairwell, and pulled out my phone. I dialed 2 numbers in rapid succession. The first was the Criminal Investigation Division of the Internal Revenue Service. I gave the agent on the line my name, a summary of the evidence, and a request for an immediate meeting. The second call was to a man named Colonel James Whitaker, a retired officer who chaired the Regional Veterans Day Memorial Committee. I told the colonel exactly what I needed. I told him the location, and I told him the date. Veterans Day. Hawthorne Lodge. 2 o'clock in the afternoon. The trap was being built, and the woman who had stolen from blind men was about to discover that the old man she despised had been watching from the shadows the entire time. The first call came on a Sunday evening while I was sitting at my workbench in the garage, dragging a carving blade through a block of scrap cherry wood. The phone buzzed against the scarred wooden surface, rotating slightly from the vibration. The screen displayed Brendan's name in white letters against the blue glow. I set down the blade. I looked at the name for 5 full seconds. Then I let it ring until the screen went dark. Art Crowley was executing my instructions with surgical precision. He had sent Jacqueline the retainer agreement on Monday morning exactly as promised, complete with a detailed questionnaire requesting extensive documentation of my alleged cognitive decline. He demanded medical evaluation records, notarized witness statements, and a comprehensive psychological profile administered by a court-approved clinician. The paperwork was an avalanche of bureaucratic complexity, designed to accomplish a single objective: delay. Jacqueline was trapped inside a legal machine that appeared to be moving forward, but was in fact standing perfectly still. She could not withdraw without abandoning her plan. She could not accelerate without producing evidence that did not exist. And every passing day without progress was clearly generating a pressure inside that household that was beginning to fracture the walls. Brendan's voicemail arrived 11 minutes after the missed call. I played it in the dim garage, the small speaker competing with the sound of wind pressing against the aluminum siding. Dad. His voice was surprisingly gentle, stripped of the corporate polish he normally wore like armor. I know yesterday was bad. I know the party did not go the way anyone expected. I am sorry about how things played out. Can we talk? Please. Call me back. I erased the message, picked up the carving blade, and resumed shaving thin ribbons of cherry wood onto the floor. By Wednesday, the frequency had doubled. 2 calls in the morning. 1 during lunch. Another at 6 in the evening. I was in my workshop each time, working the cherry wood block into a shape that had no purpose beyond keeping my hands occupied while my mind held its position. The 4th voicemail landed on Thursday afternoon. Dad. It is me again. Brendan's breathing was shallow and fast. The background noise suggested he was calling from his car, the engine running, the heater blowing. Listen. Something strange is happening here at the house. Jacqueline is making these hushed phone calls from the guest bedroom, and she hangs up the second I walk in. She is acting, I do not know, nervous, almost paranoid. Are you okay? Is everything all right with you? Just call me back, Dad. Please. He was noticing the cracks. The bureaucratic wall Art had constructed around Jacqueline was generating visible stress, and her sudden, intense secrecy was hemorrhaging into the daily rhythm of their marriage. She could not explain to Brendan why she was whispering into her phone at midnight. She could not tell him she was attempting to have his father declared legally incompetent. The lie was too large to carry quietly, and it was beginning to leak. I deleted the voicemail and turned the cherrywood block over in my hands. The 6th message arrived on Saturday during lunch. I was eating a sandwich at the kitchen table, the phone resting face down beside my plate. Dad, pick up. Please pick up. The corporate composure was gone. His voice carried a raw, trembling edge I had not heard since he was a boy waking from a nightmare. A neighbor stopped me in the driveway this morning. They asked how you were doing. They said Jacqueline mentioned to them that you were having severe memory problems, that you were getting confused and disoriented. A long, fractured pause. Dad, that is not true, right? Tell me that is not true. She was laying the groundwork, seeding the social narrative, preparing the people around them for the sudden, dramatic moment when a judge would sign a document, stripping an old man of his autonomy. By the time the conservatorship was filed, the entire neighborhood would already believe that Walt Jennings had lost his mind. I pressed delete. The calls continued through the 2nd week, with an escalating desperation that tracked precisely with Art's deliberate stonewalling. Monday, 2 calls. Tuesday, 3. By Thursday, the notification counter on my phone displayed 12 missed calls total, each one a small digital monument to my son's unraveling. On Friday evening, the 12th and final voicemail arrived. I was sitting in the cab of my van in the driveway, the engine off, staring through the windshield at the black outline of the Blue Ridge against a sky that held the last thin line of purple light. Dad, Brendan whispered. His voice was completely wrecked, jagged, scraping against his throat like a blade pulled across rough wood. I need to see you. I found something on her laptop, an email from a law firm downtown. It had your name on it, Dad, and it used the word conservatorship. A ragged, shuddering inhale. I do not know who she is anymore. I do not know what is happening. I am scared. The recording ended. The static hissed for 2 empty seconds before the system disconnected. I sat motionless in the dark cab. The phone rested in my palm like a small, glowing wound. The voice I had just heard did not belong to a 35-year-old executive in a tailored blazer. It belonged to a terrified boy standing at the edge of a darkness he could not navigate alone. A sharp tap on the driver's side window made me flinch. Doris Honeycutt, my neighbor from down the ridge, was standing on the gravel in her heavy coat, leaning slightly forward. I rolled the window down. "Walt. Honey. Are you okay?" she asked. Her face creased with concern. "Are you crying?" I reached up and touched my face. My fingertips came away wet. I had not felt the tears fall. The fortress I had constructed around myself over the past month had finally cracked, broken open by the terrified voice of the boy who used to sit under his mother's quilting frame laughing at tangled thread. "I am fine, Doris," I said softly. "Just missing Margaret tonight." She touched my arm gently, offered a sympathetic nod, and walked back down the gravel road. I sat in the silence for another 10 minutes. Then I opened the messaging application on my phone and typed a single sentence. "Son. Hawthorne Lodge. Veterans Day. 2:00 in the afternoon. Come alone. Do not tell Jacqueline." I pressed send. The screen glowed in the dark interior of the van. Exactly 3 minutes later, the status beneath the message changed to delivered, then to read. There was no reply. I set the phone face down on the passenger seat, right next to the spot where the quilt had rested just weeks earlier. I looked out at the black silhouette of the mountains against the November sky. The countdown had reached 0. I spent the next 48 hours turning my cabin into a war room. Nina Alvarez arrived Monday morning with 2 rolling suitcases and a cardboard box of manila folders thick enough to stop a bullet. She set up on the kitchen table, pushed my coffee pot to the windowsill, and laid out her system. Left side, financial forensics. Right side, victim statements. Center, timeline. She worked the way a surgeon works. Quiet hands, no wasted motion. Every document tagged, every page numbered, every bank trail highlighted in yellow or red depending on severity. I sat across from her and watched. 53 veterans, she said without looking up. Average age 68. Combined losses $1.7 million over 31 months. Every cent routed through a single clearing account registered to the Veterans Vision Fund. She slid a binder toward me. "This is the master file. Page 1 is the incorporation document. Page 14 is the first falsified tax return. Page 37 is Frank Bukowski." I opened the binder. The numbers were clean, precise, merciless. Each veteran had a profile sheet. Name, branch of service, disability rating, amount diverted, duration of enrollment, expected benefit, actual benefit received. The last column on every single sheet read the same word. 0. 0 for Sergeant Harold Kemp, 71, United States Marine Corps, $800 gone. 0 for Corporal David Atchison, 66, United States Army, $1,200 diverted over 9 months. 0 for Gunnery Sergeant Luis Padilla, 69, who lost both eyes to an improvised explosive device in Kandahar province and had $1,900 siphoned from his disability account without his knowledge. I turned each page slowly. 53 names. 53 men and women who served this country and came home broken and trusted a woman in a silk blouse to help them see again. Every page was a betrayal written in decimal points. Nina placed a second binder on the table. This one covers Constance Devereaux. She accessed the clearing account logs twice in December of last year. She downloaded transaction summaries. She never reported it, never questioned it, and 2 weeks later she co-signed a lease for a luxury apartment in downtown Charleston using funds that originated from the same account. Willfully blind, I said. Worse, Nina said. Willfully comfortable. I closed the binder and pressed my palms flat against the table. The wood was cool. I could feel the grain under my fingertips. The tiny ridges and valleys that told you where the tree had grown fast and where it had grown slow. I held my hands there until my breathing settled. What do you need from me? I asked. Nina pulled a checklist from the cardboard box. 4 items. First, the original patent certificate for the fire-resistant textile compound, United States Patent Number 7419832, assigned to Walter R. Jennings, dated October 1993. Second, the WRJ Holdings Master Ledger, all 37 properties. Current, assessed value, approximately $31 million. Third, the deed to Hawthorne Lodge, purchased August 2020 for $3.8 million during the pandemic auction. Fourth, she paused. Something personal. Something that proves who you are without paperwork. I went to the bedroom closet and took down a small wooden box from the top shelf. Inside, wrapped in a piece of olive drab cloth, was my purple heart. The ribbon was faded. The enamel was chipped on the lower left corner, where I had dropped it once in 1974, the night I came home and could not stop shaking. I held it in my palm. It weighed almost nothing. It weighed everything. "This," I said. Nina nodded once. We worked through Monday night and all of Tuesday. She organized the presentation into 3 phases. Phase 1. Walt Jennings reveals ownership of Hawthorne Lodge and the full scope of WRJ Holdings. Phase 2. Nina presents the forensic evidence of the Veterans Vision Fund fraud, including bank records, falsified filings, and victim impact statements. Phase 3. Colonel James Whitaker and 2 agents from the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division, stationed in the west hallway of the lodge, execute the arrest warrants. "She will try to fight," Nina said on Tuesday evening, stapling the last section. "Publicly. Loudly. She will call you senile. She will call me a hired gun. She will look at Brendan and cry. I know. Are you ready for that?" I looked at the binders stacked on my kitchen table. 6 inches of paper. 31 months of theft. 53 blind veterans who trusted the wrong woman. My son, who married her. "I have been ready since October," I said. Nina left Wednesday morning. I spent the rest of the day alone. I ironed a white dress shirt. The iron hissed against the cotton. I pressed each crease the way Margaret taught me, starting at the collar, working down the yoke, finishing at the cuffs. I polished my brown leather shoes with a rag and a tin of wax that was older than my son. I trimmed my beard in the bathroom mirror and looked at the man staring back. 64 years old. Gray at the temples. Hands scarred from thread, sawdust, steel, and shrapnel. Eyes tired. Jaw set. I walked to the bedroom and opened the cedar chest at the foot of the bed. The quilt was exactly where I had placed it 12 years ago. Burgundy and forest green. Interlocking rings. Margaret's final pattern, finished by my clumsy hands over 9 November nights. I lifted it carefully, folded it into thirds, and slid it into a garment bag. Then I placed the patent certificate, the master ledger, the deed to Hawthorne Lodge, and the Purple Heart into a leather briefcase that Art Crowley had given me in 1995, the day we formed WRJ Holdings. I zipped the garment bag. I latched the briefcase. I turned off every light in the cabin, except the one above Margaret's photograph on the hallway shelf. "I will bring you with me, Maggie," I whispered. The mountain was silent. The road was waiting. Veterans Day was tomorrow. The parking lot at Hawthorne Lodge was full by the time I pulled in. I drove the 1998 utility van past a row of German sedans, 2 black Cadillac Escalades, and a pearl-white Range Rover with a personalized plate that read J.D. Jennings. I parked at the far end, between a dumpster and a service entrance, the same spot the maintenance crew used on weekday mornings. I knew because I owned the building. I had approved the parking layout myself in 2021. I sat in the van for 3 minutes. The engine ticked as it cooled. Through the windshield, I could see the front entrance. Glass doors, brass handles, a doorman in a charcoal overcoat checking names on a clipboard. Inside, the Grand Ballroom was hosting a Veterans Day charity luncheon organized by the Blue Ridge Veterans Alliance. 200 guests, cloth napkins, a string quartet, and somewhere in that crowd, a woman who had stolen $1.7 million from blind veterans while pretending to help them see. I reached across the passenger seat and placed my hand on the garment bag. Through the fabric I could feel the quilt, burgundy and forest green. Margaret's interlocking rings. I let my fingers rest there for a moment, feeling the texture, the weight, the warmth that cotton holds even when no one is wearing it. Then I picked up the leather briefcase, hung the garment bag over my left arm, and stepped out of the van. The doorman did not recognize me. He glanced at my brown leather shoes, my pressed white shirt, my trimmed gray beard, and asked for my name. I told him. He scanned the list twice, frowned, and said I was not on it. "Check the ownership records," I said quietly. He blinked. A woman behind the reception desk leaned over, whispered something, and the doorman stepped aside without another word. The ballroom was exactly as I remembered from the renovation blueprints. 30-foot ceilings, crystal chandeliers, hardwood floors that my contractor had sourced from a reclaimed barn in Watauga County. The room smelled like roasted lamb, fresh bread, and expensive perfume. Round tables with white linen stretched from the entrance to a raised stage at the far end, where a podium stood under a projected American flag. I saw them immediately. Jacqueline sat at table 3, center of the room, wearing a navy dress with pearl earrings. Her posture was perfect. Her smile was practiced. Constance Devereaux sat to her left, silver hair pinned in a tight chignon, nodding slowly at a man in a charcoal suit. And beside Jacqueline, in a pressed blazer with no tie, was my son. Brendan looked thinner than I remembered. His shoulders were tense. His eyes moved across the room in small, nervous arcs. When they landed on me, he froze. His mouth opened slightly. He did not wave. He did not stand. He gripped the edge of the table with both hands and stared. I walked forward. Guests turned to look. An old man carrying a garment bag and a leather briefcase through a charity luncheon attracts attention the way a scratch on a violin string does. Not loud, just wrong enough to make people stop chewing. I reached the stage, climbed the 3 carpeted steps, and set the briefcase on the podium. The string quartet trailed off. The room went quiet. "My name is Walter Jennings," I said into the microphone. My voice was steady. "Most of you know me as the retired textile worker from Elk Ridge. Some of you saw me at my grandson's celebration last month, holding a quilt that was called used fabric." I heard a chair scrape. Jacqueline's head turned sharply toward Constance. Constance did not move. "I am also the sole owner of this building," I continued. Hawthorne Lodge was purchased on August 14, 2020, for $3.8 million through a holding company called WRJ Holdings LLC. I am the sole member of that company. I hold 37 commercial and residential properties across 4 counties. The current assessed value is approximately $31 million. The silence in the room was absolute. 200 people, and I could hear the ice melting in someone's water glass. "I did not come here to talk about money," I said. "I came here because 53 veterans in this region are enrolled in an organization called the Veterans Vision Fund. That fund promised to restore their sight. It collected $1.7 million in donations and government-matched grants over 31 months. Not 1 cent reached a single veteran." I opened the briefcase. I placed Nina's master binder on the podium. I placed the patent certificate beside it. I placed the deed to Hawthorne Lodge on top. And last, I placed the Purple Heart, chipped enamel and faded ribbon, in front of the microphone where every camera in the room could see it. "The fund was created and operated by Jacqueline Devereaux Jennings," I said. Sitting at table 3, every head turned. Jacqueline stood. Her chair fell backward and hit the floor with a sharp crack. Her face was white. Her mouth formed a word that did not come out. Constance reached for her daughter's wrist, but Jacqueline pulled free. "This is insane," she said. Her voice was loud but thin, like a wire pulled too tight. "He is a senile old man. He lives in a cabin. He drives a van from the 90s. Brendan, tell them." She looked at my son. Brendan did not speak. He sat with his hands flat on the table, the same way I had pressed my hands against the kitchen table 2 nights ago. His jaw moved once. His eyes were wet. From the west hallway, a door opened. Colonel James Whitaker stepped through, followed by 2 agents in dark suits, with federal badges clipped to their belts. Jacqueline turned toward the sound. Her pearl earring caught the chandelier light and flashed once, bright and brief, like a signal no one had asked for. The colonel nodded at me. I unzipped the garment bag and lifted the quilt into the light. Jacqueline did not run. I will give her that. She stood at table 3, with her fallen chair behind her, and 200 pairs of eyes pressing against her skin like heat from an open furnace. And she did not run. She straightened her spine, adjusted her pearl earring with 2 fingers, and looked directly at me. "You are delusional," she said. Her voice carried across the silent ballroom. "This man has early-onset dementia. My husband and I have been seeking medical evaluation for months. This is exactly the kind of paranoid episode we were afraid of." She turned to the crowd. She was good. I had always known she was good. Her eyes swept the room with the precision of a woman who had spent her entire adult life controlling what other people believed. She softened her expression. She tilted her chin down slightly, the way a person does when they want to appear vulnerable. "We love him," she said. "We have been trying to protect him." Colonel Whitaker did not wait. He crossed the ballroom floor in 7 strides, his shoes clicking against the reclaimed hardwood. The 2 agents flanked him, 1 on each side. Badges visible, postures straight. The colonel stopped 4 feet from Jacqueline and spoke in a voice that did not need a microphone. "Mrs. Jacqueline Devereaux Jennings. My name is Colonel James Whitaker, liaison to the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division. You are being placed under arrest for wire fraud, tax fraud, and theft of government-matched veterans' benefits, totaling $1.7 million over 31 months through the entity known as the Veterans Vision Fund." Jacqueline's mouth opened. No sound came out. The first agent stepped forward and read the Miranda warning. Every word landed in the silence like a stone dropped into still water. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be appointed for you." Jacqueline found her voice on the last sentence. "I can afford an attorney," she said. The words came out sharp and automatic, and for 1 brief second her mask slipped. Not fear, not shame, anger, pure, compressed, white-hot anger at being caught. The second agent turned to Constance Devereaux, who had not moved from her chair. Constance sat perfectly still, silver hair gleaming under the chandelier, both hands folded on the white linen tablecloth. She looked like a woman posing for a portrait she had already decided would be flattering. "Mrs. Constance Elaine Devereaux," the agent said, "you are being placed under arrest as an accessory to wire fraud and tax fraud. Records indicate you accessed the Veterans Vision Fund clearing account logs on December 3rd and December 19th of last year, downloaded transaction summaries, and failed to report known financial irregularities." Constance blinked once. She unfolded her hands. She looked at her daughter. "I told you," she said quietly, "to use a different account." The room heard it. Every table, every guest, every server holding a tray of sparkling water along the far wall. Constance Devereaux, in 6 words, confirmed everything. Jacqueline closed her eyes. The agents guided both women toward the west hallway. Jacqueline walked with her chin raised, her navy dress smooth, her heels clicking a rhythm that grew faster as she neared the door. Constance followed with her hands clasped in front of her, silent, her silver chignon catching the light one final time before she disappeared through the doorway. The ballroom exhaled. 200 people began to murmur at once. Chairs shifted. Someone coughed. A woman at table 7 pressed her napkin to her mouth. A man near the back stood up and then sat down again. Unsure of what protocol applied to watching an arrest at a charity luncheon, I remained at the podium. I had not moved since lifting the quilt. It was still in my hands, draped over both arms, burgundy and forest green, catching the chandelier light in alternating bands. Margaret's interlocking rings, her pattern, my stitching, crooked in places, uneven along the border where my hands had trembled on the 9th night, but whole, complete, held together by thread and promise, and 4 months of grief. I looked at Brendan. He was still seated at table 3. The chair beside him was empty where Jacqueline had stood. The chair on the other side was empty where Constance had sat. My son was alone at a round table set for 8, surrounded by abandoned wine glasses and untouched salad plates, and a centerpiece of white chrysanthemums that no one would remember ordering. His hands were still flat on the table. His shoulders were shaking. I stepped down from the stage. I walked across the ballroom floor, past the staring faces, past the whispers, past the string quartet that sat frozen with their bows suspended above their instruments. I reached table 3 and stood in front of my son. He looked up. His face was wet. His lips pressed together hard, the way a man does when he is trying to hold something inside that is already too large for his body. "Dad," he said, one word. The first honest word he had spoken to me in 2 years. I pulled out the empty chair beside him. I sat down. I unfolded the quilt across the table, covering the abandoned plates and the wine glasses and the white linen, spreading Margaret's interlocking rings over everything that was broken. "Your mother made this pattern," I said. "I finished it after she died. Every square is cut from someone we loved." Brendan reached out and touched the corner of the quilt. His fingers found the small square of pale blue cotton near the center. He recognized it. I could tell because his hand stopped moving, and his breath caught, and he looked at me with an expression I had not seen since he was 6 years old. Standing in the doorway of our cabin, holding a spool of thread he had found under his mother's quilting frame. "That is your baby blanket," I said. He pulled the quilt toward him and pressed his face into it and wept. I put my hand on his shoulder and held it there. We sat at that table for a long time. The ballroom emptied slowly around us. Guests gathered their coats and their opinions and left through the front doors in small clusters, speaking in low voices the way people do when they have witnessed something they will talk about for years, but do not yet know how to describe. The servers cleared the other tables quietly. One of them paused near us, looked at the quilt spread across the plates, and decided to leave table 3 alone. Brendan lifted his face from the quilt. His eyes were swollen. His nose was red. He looked like he had when he was 9 years old and fell from the oak tree behind the cabin and broke his wrist and sat on the kitchen floor holding it against his chest, too proud to scream but too hurt to pretend. "How long?" he said. His voice cracked on the second word. "How long have you known about her?" "Since the day after the party," I said. "Your son's celebration. The night she called. My quilt used fabric." He flinched. I did not soften it. He needed to hear the words exactly as they had been spoken. In the same room where they had been spoken, at a table 500 feet from the stage, where a woman in pearl earrings had just been led away in federal custody. "I called Art Crowley the next morning," I continued. "He told me Jacqueline had already contacted him about a conservatorship. She wanted you to have power of attorney over me. She wanted me declared incompetent." Brendan pressed his knuckles against his forehead. "I did not know about the conservatorship," he said. "I swear. She told me she was consulting a lawyer about estate planning. She said it was for your benefit, and you believed her." "Yes," without calling me. He lowered his hands. "Yes." I let the silence hold. Outside the tall ballroom windows, the November sky was turning the color of old pewter. The mountains beyond the parking lot were dark blue ridgelines stacked one behind the other, growing paler, with distance until the farthest range dissolved into cloud. I had looked at those mountains every morning for 40 years, and they had never once lied to me. Tell me everything, I said. From the beginning, Brendan exhaled. He pressed his palms against the quilt and began to speak. He told me how Jacqueline had appeared in the summer of 2019, confident and warm and full of plans. How she had admired his work ethic, praised his modesty, told him he deserved more than a small-town life in the shadow of a mountain. How she had introduced him to people in Charleston who wore watches that cost more than his truck and spoke about money the way farmers speak about weather, constantly and without embarrassment. He told me how the wedding had happened fast, how her mother Constance had organized everything, the venue, the guest list, the caterer, the florist, and how he had stood at the altar feeling like a guest at his own ceremony, how I had been seated in the back row, and how he had looked for me during the vows and seen my face, and felt something twist inside his chest, but did not know what to call it. He told me about the fund, the Veterans Vision Fund. He said Jacqueline had described it as a nonprofit she co-managed with a board of advisors. She handled the finances. He never saw the books. He never asked. He signed a joint tax return in April of 2023 and did not read past the second page. She told me it was standard, he said. She told me nonprofits have complicated returns. I believed her because I wanted to believe her, because believing her was easier than asking questions that might break everything apart. I listened without interrupting. I owed him that, not because he deserved comfort, but because a father who does not listen to his son's confession has no right to expect his son to listen to anything else ever again. He told me about the phone calls, the 12 voicemails he had left after I stopped answering. He said the first 3 were apologies. The 4th was fear. The 5th was Jacqueline pacing the living room at 2 a.m, whispering into her phone. The 6th was the conservatorship email he had found open on her laptop, with Art Crowley's name in the subject line. That is when I knew, he said. Not everything, but enough. Enough to understand that she was not protecting you. She was circling you, and you still did not call me. I was afraid, he said. I was afraid you would not answer. And I was afraid of what it would mean if you did. I nodded. Fear is a thread that pulls tight in both directions. I had been afraid too. Afraid that my son was gone. Afraid that the boy who once sorted thread spools on the cabin floor had been replaced by a man I could not reach. Afraid that Margaret's death had opened a silence between us that no quilt could cover. But here we were, sitting at an empty table in a ballroom that I owned, surrounded by cleared plates and fading light, with a quilt between us that held the fabric of everyone we had ever lost. Stand up, I said. He looked at me. Stand up, Brendan. He stood. I folded the quilt carefully, pressing each crease flat with my palm. I tucked it under my arm, the same way I had tucked it the night of the party. Then I walked toward the glass doors at the back of the ballroom that opened onto the lodge garden. Brendan followed. The garden was bare for November. The boxwood hedges were trimmed low. The gravel paths wound between empty flower beds and a stone fountain that had been drained for winter. The air was cold and smelled like wet leaves and wood smoke from a chimney somewhere down the valley. We walked side by side without speaking. Our shoes crunched on the gravel. The mountains watched. The sky darkened by one shade. After a long time, Brendan said, "Can I come home?" I did not answer right away. I kept walking. The gravel crunched. The wind moved through the bare branches above us. The door was never locked, I said. I drove home alone that evening. Brendan had offered to follow me in his car, but I told him to go back to his apartment in Asheville and sleep. Not because I did not want him near, because a man who has just watched his wife get arrested needs one night of silence to understand what his life looks like without her in it. I knew that kind of silence. I had lived inside it for 12 years. The mountain road was dark by 5:30. My headlights cut through the November fog in 2 pale cones that barely reached 30 feet ahead. The van rattled over the gravel turnoff and climbed the last quarter mile to the cabin. I parked, killed the engine, and sat in the cold until my breath fogged the windshield. Inside, the cabin smelled the way it always smelled. Cedar, machine oil, the faint ghost of Margaret's lavender soap that had soaked into the bathroom walls over 20 years of use and refused to leave. I set the garment bag on the kitchen table, placed the briefcase beside it, and stood in the hallway looking at her photograph on the shelf. "It is done, Maggie," I said. The photograph did not answer. It never did. But I had learned over 12 years that speaking to a woman who cannot respond is not the same as speaking to no one. The words, "Leave your mouth and enter the room and settle into the walls and become part of the house." The same way sawdust settles into floorboard cracks and becomes part of the structure. Margaret was in every wall of this cabin. Every word I had spoken to her since April of 2012 was in there too. I made tea. I sat at the kitchen table. I unzipped the garment bag and spread the quilt across the surface, smoothing each crease with my palm, burgundy and forest green. Interlocking rings. The stitching along the left border was still uneven, where my hands had trembled on the 9th night. I traced the crooked line with my index finger and smiled for the first time in 6 weeks. The phone rang at 8:14. Nina Alvarez. I picked up on the second ring. "It is done on our end too," she said. Her voice was tired but steady. The voice of a woman who had finished a long race and was cooling down. "Jacqueline and Constance are being held at the Buncombe County Detention Center. Federal arraignment is scheduled for Monday morning. Bond will be requested, but I expect the judge to deny it, given the flight risk and the amount involved." "The veterans," I said. "Colonel Whitaker has already contacted the Veterans Affairs Regional Office. All 53 accounts flagged for restitution review. The process will take months. But the freeze on the clearing account means the remaining funds, approximately $412,000, are secured. And the rest? Gone. Spent. Luxury goods, travel, the Charleston apartment lease, and approximately $600,000 in transfers to an offshore account in the Caymans that Constance opened in 2022. Recovery will depend on asset seizure." I wrote the number on a napkin. $412,000. Out of $1.7 million. Less than a quarter. 53 veterans had trusted a woman with their darkness, and she had spent 76% of their hope on handbags and beach houses. "What about Frank?" I asked. Nina paused. "Frank Bukowski's case is the strongest individual claim. $22,400 diverted over 36 months. His daughter Linda has already been contacted. The VA is expediting his surgical evaluation. Colonel Whitaker personally guaranteed it." I closed my eyes. Frank's apartment in Oakdale. 3rd floor. No elevator. The folded flag on the shelf. His rough fingers reading my knuckles like Braille. I trust working hands. I opened my eyes and wrote his name on the napkin beside the number. "One more thing," Nina said. "Brendan. What about him? He signed the 2023 joint tax return. Technically, that creates exposure. But I spoke with the Assistant United States Attorney this afternoon. Given that Brendan had no knowledge of the fund's operations, no access to the accounts, and no financial benefit beyond standard marital deductions, they are not pursuing charges. He will be called as a cooperating witness." I exhaled. The air left my lungs slowly, carrying a weight I had not realized I was holding. My son would not go to prison. My son would stand in a courtroom and tell the truth and walk out the same door he walked in. That was more than I had allowed myself to hope for since October. "Thank you, Nina," I said. "Do not thank me yet," she said. "Thank me when the last veteran gets his money back." She hung up. I set the phone on the table next to the quilt and the napkin with Frank's name on it, and sat in the silence of the cabin for a long time. At 9:30, I walked to the storage room and opened the fireproof cabinet. I pulled the WRJ Holdings master ledger from the second drawer and carried it to the kitchen table. I opened it to the page marked Hawthorne Lodge and studied the numbers. Purchase price $3.8 million. Annual operating revenue $940,000. Current assessed value $5.1 million. Net positive cash flow since 2021. I turned to a blank page at the back of the ledger and picked up a pencil. At the top of the page I wrote 2 words. Margaret's shelter. Below that I began to sketch. A single-story building, 12 residential units, a communal kitchen, a quilting room with wide windows facing east so the morning light would fall across the fabric tables, a medical suite for visiting eye specialists, a garden with raised beds that a man in a wheelchair could reach without bending, a sign above the front door that read, "For those who served and those who stitched." I drew for 2 hours. The pencil wore down to a stub. The lines were rough, the proportions imperfect, the way a carpenter draws when he is not an architect, but knows exactly what a building needs to feel like a home. At 11:45, I set the pencil down and looked at the sketch. It was not finished, but the bones were there. The foundation, the frame, everything else, I would build thread by thread. The shelter opened on the second Saturday of June. I had spent 7 months building it. Not alone. Brendan drove up from Asheville every Friday evening and stayed through Sunday, sleeping in his old bedroom at the cabin, the one with the slanted ceiling and the window that faced the ridge. He did not talk much those first weeks. He arrived, changed into work clothes, and waited for me to hand him a task. I gave him the framing. He was good with a hammer. He had always been good with a hammer, even as a boy, when I let him tap finishing nails into baseboards, while Margaret watched from the kitchen doorway and pretended not to worry. We hired a crew of 9. Local men. 2 of them were veterans. One, a quiet electrician named Dale Odom, had served in the same battalion as Ray Dominguez, though they had never met. When I told Dale about Stitch, about the foxholes south of the Mekong Delta and the promise made over a burning uniform, he stood still for a long time and then went back to wiring the quilting room without saying a word. He finished it 2 days ahead of schedule. The building sat on a 3-acre parcel at the base of Elk Ridge, half a mile from my cabin. Single story. 12 residential units, each with a private bathroom and a window facing east. A communal kitchen with a long oak table that could seat 20. A medical suite with adjustable examination chairs and blackout curtains for the visiting eye specialists who would rotate through every 2 weeks. A garden with raised beds built at wheelchair height, framed in cedar that I had milled myself from a fallen tree behind the property. And at the center of the building, a quilting room, wide windows, morning light. 4 fabric tables arranged in a square so that anyone sitting at one could see everyone sitting at the others. A pegboard wall holding 60 spools of thread in every color Margaret had ever used. I had ordered them from the same supplier in Boone, where she had bought her thread for 30 years. The woman at the counter recognized the order and asked if Margaret was starting a new project. I told her, yes. Above the front door, a carved wooden sign read, "Margaret's Shelter. For those who served and those who stitched." I carved it myself. Cherry wood. The letters were clean and deep. I sealed them with 3 coats of marine varnish so the rain would not blur her name. Frank Bukowski moved into Unit 7 on opening day. His daughter Linda drove him from Asheville in a rented sedan. Frank walked through the front door with his white cane in one hand and a folded American flag in the other. He stopped beneath the sign, tilted his head upward even though he could not see it, and asked me to read it aloud. I read it. He nodded once. "She must have been something," he said. "She was," I said. The surgical evaluation had confirmed that Frank was a candidate for partial restoration of peripheral vision. The procedure was scheduled for August. Colonel Whitaker had arranged for the VA to cover the full cost. Frank said he wanted the first thing he saw, if the surgery worked, to be the quilting room. I told him I would make sure the light was on. 51 of the 53 veterans received restitution by May. The federal asset seizure recovered an additional $618,000 from the offshore account in the Caymans. Combined with the frozen funds, the total return to veterans exceeded $1 million. The remainder was covered by a grant I funded through WRJ Holdings. Quietly. The same way I had done everything for 26 years. Jacqueline Devereaux Jennings pleaded guilty to wire fraud and tax fraud in March. She was sentenced to 51 months in federal prison. Constance Devereaux pleaded guilty to accessory charges and received 24 months. Neither of them spoke to Brendan after the arraignment. He did not ask them to. On opening day, Brendan stood beside me in the garden as the first residents arrived. He wore jeans, work boots, and a flannel shirt with sawdust on the cuffs. He looked like his mother. He had always looked like his mother, but I had stopped seeing it during the years he was gone. Now, standing in the June light with his sleeves rolled up and his hands dirty from carrying furniture, I could see Margaret in his jaw, in his posture, in the way he turned his head slightly when he listened. "Dad," he said, "I want to bring Tommy up here next weekend. If that is all right." Tommy was 8 months old now. Brendan had been granted temporary custody after Jacqueline's sentencing. The boy lived in Brendan's apartment in Asheville, in a crib near the window, in a room that Brendan had painted pale blue the same week his mother was arrested. "Bring him," I said. The following Saturday, Brendan carried Tommy through the cabin door in a car seat. The boy was awake, round-faced, dark-eyed, gripping a plastic ring with both fists. Brendan set the car seat on the kitchen table. The same table where I had spread Nina's evidence binders. The same table where I had sketched the shelter with a pencil stub. The same table where Margaret had rolled out fabric for 30 years. I went to the bedroom and opened the cedar chest. The quilt was folded exactly as I had left it. Burgundy and forest green. Interlocking rings. I carried it to the kitchen and spread it across the table. And then I lifted Tommy out of his car seat and laid him on it. He kicked once. His small fingers found the edge of the pale blue square, the one cut from Brendan's baby blanket, and held on. Brendan watched. His eyes were wet again. But this time, he was smiling. I reached into my shirt pocket and took out a small object I had been carving for 3 months. A wooden horse. Cherry wood. Smooth as river stone. Small enough to fit in a baby's palm. I had sanded it with 4 grits of paper and sealed it with beeswax the way my father had taught me before I knew what a lathe was. I placed it in Tommy's free hand. He held the horse in one fist and the quilt in the other, and he looked up at me with eyes that had not yet learned to judge what anything was worth. "Every square holds someone," I told him. "And now, so do you."